Why do you all believe that in ancient and medieval times people wore only drab colors, only browns and grays and yellows and tans and whites and blacks and only nuances in between, but no colors? Well, that image can't be further from the truth. Stick around and I'll tell you why. Hello everyone and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. On today's episode we'll be talking about colors and pigments in ancient times. But before we do so, let us take a look at not the miniature but the miniatures. Yes, there are 3 of them. These are mains from WizKids, and as you can see they are quite interesting and we're gonna have a lot of fun painting them today. With that out of the way, let's set the scene. Some of my D&D players are guilty of this idea that in ancient times and medieval times color was not as abundant when it came to clothing, when it came to decorating buildings, when it came to statues even, and it can be further from the truth. Although, granted, there were pigments and colors that were harder to access by common folk because of the sheer price for production, or because they were reserved either for nobility or for the clergy, or they were symbols of status. I agree, nowadays pigments are quite easy and cheap to obtain, although not all of them, as opposed to antiquity and medieval times, but this didn't mean that people didn't wear colorful clothing or didn't use color in their lives. As human beings, we enjoy colors, we enjoy knickknacks, we enjoy shiny things. You know, that goblin inside all of us. At my D&D table, I try to make a point of describing everything as being quite colorful, because I really enjoy colors and because I want to convince my players that the world in ancient times and in medieval times was quite colorful. For today's episode, I heavily relied on sources from ancient times, especially ancient Rome, and I heavily relied on the work of Vitruvius, De Architectura. Vitruvius was an architect and engineer from the 1st century CE who dedicated his life's work to Augustus, the first Roman emperor. His work includes and describes things ranging from pigments, today's topic, to sewage, to standardization of water pipes, to how to properly build a dwelling so that the inhabitants are always in good health depending on its orientation and the number of windows and the sun, how to determine the winds blowing in a certain area using colorful chalk and towers, but that's another story for another time, you already know the drill, and everything in between. Based on his descriptions, based on his training and based on his age, most likely he served under Caesar as a military engineer, building ballistas, scorpions and other siege engines. Although we can't be 100% sure that he served under Caesar, based on the battles and sieges he describes, most likely he actually took part in those battles, and as such he was able to recount things in great detail. His work, De Architectura, is a cornerstone when it comes to Roman building methods. His work advises and sort of establishes how settlements should be built in order to avoid certain winds in certain periods of the year so that people don't get sick, how to build depending on the area where you want to build your settlement, how to build depending on the surrounding area, how to build and what materials to use. Romans took his work to heart and put it into practice for centuries after his death. But enough about Vitruvius, let's take a moment, take a look at the miniature, see the direction I am heading in, and we'll come back to talk about pigments. I finished applying a coat of Nuln Oil to all three miniatures, and once I made sure they were dry, I went back to the mix of Fenrisian Blue from Citadel and Undead Flesh from MSP Bones, with the goal of revigorating the highlights dulled by the Nuln Oil. I'm making sure that the paint is thinned down by applying it on my fingernail and adjusting if necessary. I will be adding back the highlights on all three miniatures. Welcome back, let's talk pigments. Throughout human history, people developed new methods of obtaining, of processing, and of applying pigments. In prehistory, in the Stone Age, people had access to only a handful of pigments: reds, yellows, browns, blacks, and whites, and this slowly, with the passage of time, evolved into having today a myriad of colors, of nuances, and of shades that we can all enjoy and we can all play around with. It is quite interesting to see how we got to today. In order to better understand this process, our story takes us to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. We'll be talking about ancient Egypt and we're going to be talking about ancient Rome. Ancient Egypt because the Egyptians were the first ones to create a synthetic pigment. We're gonna get to it. And the Romans because they gathered all the knowledge around the Mediterranean Sea and from their furthest provinces and brought everything together in a very almost standardized method of obtaining colors. And because we have a lot of sources detailing how the Romans went about to obtain certain colors. Pigments in ancient times, as it happens today, can be divided into two categories. The first, natural pigments, and the second, artificial or synthetic pigments. We're gonna start talking about natural pigments. Yellow ochre, red earths, both are quite common. They are easy to turn into pigments, they are easy to apply, and they have been used since the dawn of humanity. Romans also had, of course, different kinds of whites obtained through different methods, but usually from limestone, so chalk, and for black they used charcoal black and burnt bone black. But these aren't the interesting pigments. Let's talk about something that the Romans eventually abandoned, and for good reason. It was an orange pigment, orpiment, and it is obtained from arsenic. Now, we don't know how they handled it, we don't know how they applied it, but we know they abandoned it. They quickly realized that people using this pigment died. As such, they stopped using it. They also used cinnabar, or mercury sulfide. This is a mineral that contains a lot of mercury. The ancient sources tell us that whenever it was struck, it shed tears of quicksilver or mercury. The ancient Romans would take blocks of this stuff and bake it until all the mercury was drawn out, and then simply pulverize it and use it as a pigment for frescoes or for decorating statues. The only downside is that this pigment turned black really fast when exposed to sunlight or to moonlight. Of course, there were methods of avoiding this by coating it with certain kind of wax, but we're not going to detail more than this. Vitruvius tells us that blocks of cinnabar were brought from Hispania, nowadays Spain, or from Ephesus, modern-day Turkey, to Rome, where public contractors would process the stuff and extract the mercury and create the vermilion pigment. Green was obtained from malachite. Malachite was extracted from copper mines in Macedonia, or it was brought from Armenia and it was called Armenian blue, or it was called Indian ink, depending on the depth of color and the nuance of the malachite. And blue was obtained from azurite. Azurite is a very close cousin of malachite and usually are found together. But we have to get to the really good stuff. Before we do so, let's all do our part. You take a moment and hit that like button, and I will be talking about the miniatures and explaining the colors I am using to bring them to life. With Pink Horror from Citadel, I am going around all three miniatures and painting in their open wounds. The name of the color sounded perfect for this task. Pink Horror. I have to admit, I enjoyed the process and it gave me the chance of using pink, a color I don't use all that often in my painting. I'm adding it unaltered and will go back with Mephiston Red to paint the center of the wound, making them gnarlier. And I will also add some Nargle Rot on the edges of the wounds. The minis are quite beautiful in their gruesomeness and are sure to impress my players. Although they are quite weak in D&D, a horde of these little buggers will pair well with the Nalfishni I painted last episode. Now let's talk about artificial pigments. If you are wondering what other black pigments did the Romans use beside charcoal black and burnt bone black, well, you're in luck, as I am here to tell you. They used quite an ingenious method, although a little bit strange but fascinating at the same time. They would use a small circular room, usually a dry sauna, finished on the inside with marble, and they would block off all windows and all entrances. In a door frame they would build a small furnace, they would seal the door frame completely, and they would make sure that the smoke vents would be inside the room. In this furnace they would burn different kinds of resin so that the smoke was really dark and was quite sticky. Over the course of several hours to even days, the smoke would settle on the walls, would cool down and would solidify. Once this process was done, the door frame was unsealed and they would simply walk in and scrape black resin deposited on the finished marble walls. They would take this resin and pulverize it, mix it with different binders and use it. If that didn't impress you, I don't know what else will. There were of course other very cheap alternatives to obtain different kinds of shades of black, such as burning peach pine shavings and splinters and resin and just turning everything into coal, pulverizing it into a mortar and pestle and mix it with binders. This method didn't really yield pigments as rich and dark and as of a higher quality as the previous method did. Now let's take a few moments and talk about Egypt, because I'm about to blow your socks off. The Egyptians invented the first synthetic pigment, and by doing so they invented a color: blue. Blue is a very rare color in nature. There are very few natural sources of blue pigments, and the Egyptians were the first to create a synthetic blue pigment. Before they did so and named it, there was no blue. It's kinda hard to explain, but I'll give it a shot. Things that are blue were blue back then: the sky, the sea, the wings of a butterfly. But people didn't have a word for blue, and as such for them it didn't exist. Everything that we describe as being blue, they described as being either dark or black or green or violet. They didn't have a word for blue. As such, they couldn't differentiate, they couldn't make out the color blue. Research done on languages across the world revealed that at the dawn of civilizations, at the dawn of language, the first two colors to enter the vocabulary were black and white because they represent night and day. The third color to enter the vocabulary was red because it signaled danger. It was the color of blood, so again danger, and the color of some ripe fruit. Then the fourth and the fifth color to enter a language are green and yellow, and usually they can be interchangeable and are assigned to plants and fruit that are ready for harvest and ready to be eaten. And then the last color is blue. In 3000 BCE, so 5000 years ago, the Egyptians created the first blue pigment and they invented the color blue. Although they used a bit of azurite before that and a little bit of lapis lazuli, but they couldn't really differentiate between the color blue of the azurite and the green of the malachite. Thus, they were the first to create blue. Blue is obtained by heating copper mixed with quartz and calcium to very high temperatures, and then this is the result. I made this personally. They're not the best kind of blue, they should be glossy, but they are Egyptian blue. This is the first blue color. From this, humans learned what blue was, and they started differentiate between different nuances and shades of blue. Romans had different methods of extracting blue, but they all revolved around copper. They obtained white by placing lead in vinegar. They obtained verdigris by placing copper in vinegar. Verdigris is the color of old copper, such as the Statue of Liberty. That's a very good example. That's verdigris. And before we move to the pièce de résistance, let's take one more look at the miniature and comment on how I'm doing. After all wounds are done and all shadows are in place, I'm going around all three minis with undead flesh from MSP bones for the final round of highlights. I'm adding a very thin layer as I only want to make the highest details pop. I'm going for the head, the cheekbones, the shoulders and the upper edges of the wounds, accentuating the gruesomeness of these wounds. I always worry a bit when I'm adding the final highlights. I'm afraid of either adding too much, not enough, or just messing up the paint job. But I like experimenting and always try to learn something new, even if I mess it up. It can easily be repaired, and it is a learning experience. And now, the grand finale, the pièce de résistance, purple. I know my t-shirt doesn't look purple on camera, but believe you me, this is a darker shade of purple. In ancient times, purple was reserved for the emperor and for the members of the Senate, both Angusti Clavi and Lati Clavi. This is a story for another time, but basically the width of the stripe that decorated the toga of a senator marked their status and rank within the Roman Senate. But another story for another time. Purple was obtained by pulverizing shellfish using a mortar. The resulting purple liquid would be strained through linen cloth and very quickly mixed with honey because it was quite salty and it evaporated very fast. Vitruvius mentions there is a direct correlation between the shade obtained from this shellfish and the course of the sun. The further north you went from the Mediterranean Sea, the resulting pigment would be of a bluish shade. The further inland you went from the east or the west coast of the Mediterranean, the more violet it was, and the further south you went from the coast, the redder it would be. This pigment was very expensive because it required a very large amount of shellfish to be processed in order to obtain a relatively small quantity of this pigment. Of course, there were also cheaper versions of purple that were more accessible to the wider public, made by boiling bilberries in milk, straining them using a linen cloth, and then mixing the resulting liquid with powdered chalk and turning it into a paste. when it comes to other pigments such as other shades of yellow or other shades of blue or of green, people learned how to obtain them by using plants such as the mother root, such as turmeric in the Indian subcontinent, other pigments such as the dyer's weed that yields a very vivid green color, or the wood for indigo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but this is how it's spelled. And by doing this, people developed the method of obtaining different pigments, different colors, and color became cheaper and more widely available. And with that, before we conclude today's episode, I want to give you a bonus bit of information. If you've ever been to Rome or to Athens or to any other ancient city, I'm sure you saw all these magnificent edifices, all these magnificent public buildings in that white marble. And I know you are familiar with ancient, especially Roman statues, those white, gorgeous, very detailed statues. Well, I'm here to tell you that they were actually colored, and some of them were, I would call them kitschy. People made a point of using very bright, very vivid colors to show prosperity, to show wealth, to draw attention to those monuments, to those statues. Everything was colored, everything was painted. For us, it would look very, very kitschy, it would look very strange, but for the ancients, it was a point of pride to have their cities painted in all these vivid colors. I'm gonna give you one particular example. This is a very famous, very, as you can see, powerful image of Augustus. This is Augustus of Prima Porta. Now, this is the interpretation of the statue as it was in ancient times. Stark difference, isn't there? For us, it is quite strange. For them, it was reality. The white marble statues and the white marble edifices we see today are the result of thousands of years of exposure to the elements. Everything was colorful. And with that, I truly hope you found inspiration today and learned something new. And remember, next time you're at your D&D table, or next time you are playing any TTRPG, or the next time you create something medieval themed or ancient themed, people loved color. It was a sign of status. It was something they actively sought out. It was something they put money aside for. Color was everywhere, not in the same variety as we have today, but it was present. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I can't wait to see you all here next week on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.